Hello, this is Pastor Terry Goodman, and I want to welcome you to the Wesleyan Connection. This podcast is primarily for the clergy and laity of the Holston Annual Conference. Join with me now as I take a look around the Connection and share some of the things happening in the churches of our annual conference. Hello, this is Pastor Terry Goodman, and I want to welcome you to this week's edition of the Wesleyan Connection. You know, if you've been following along, you will have noted that right before Christmas was the last podcast that I did. I indicated during that podcast that I was probably going to take a few weeks off, what with all the Christmas activities and what with trying to go on vacation and then starting the year back up. You know, as United Methodist ministers, that beginning of the year tends to be a rather busy time because one of the things that we have to do is we have to do the year-end reports. The year-end reports are all those lovely numbers that we have to take and we have to crunch together and figure out how much we spent here and how much we spent there. We have to figure out how many people joined, how many people left, how they joined, what's the new numbers. And so it took me a better part of 2 days to get all the numbers from my treasurer and then to crunch them down into the various categories to which the numbers belonged. So that's always a fun time at the end of the year, actually the beginning of the new year, because you can't do it until you actually close everything out. And then following that, I was on retreat after spending a weekend with the youth for Resurrection, and I was on retreat last week in Pigeon Forge, sort of a self-directed spiritual retreat. But now I think I'm going to try to get back on schedule with these weekly podcasts. And this one, since I just opened by talking about numbers, I want to talk about some more numbers. I was listening to a live feed from a Facebook page this morning. Let me see if I can bring up the name of the pastor again. Pastor Mike Holmes. From the way he sounds, it sounds like his church is somewhere maybe up in Michigan or up north near Canada. I'm not real clear from his Facebook page about that. But he was talking about numbers and metrics that a local church needs to think about. And he got me to thinking on his first set of metrics. And I can't remember exactly the phrase. He had some nice catchy phrases, but it's sort of, let's use this as an example. Let's say that you have a church that averages 75 people on a Sunday morning. And you decide that one of the things that you want to do a year from now is to have a church that averages 100 people on a Sunday morning. He said those numbers are very important. He says if you as a church want to go from the 75 to the 100, then you need to plan. And I got to thinking about that. What would it be like if we just decided that one day I'm a church of 75 and the next day I'm a church of 100? What if our worship space was really good at holding 75 people, but then we don't have enough chairs for 100 people? And so there's something about what he said that got me to thinking. If we are going to set goals for the future, if we're going to set a goal to have 100 in worship next year or 125 in worship next year, somewhere between today and when we hope that goal to be accomplished, we are going to have to do something to make sure that we are capable of handling 125 people. For instance, do we have the seating in our sanctuary to handle 125 people? What if we can only easily handle 90 or 100? What do we do with that extra 25 that we hope to come? Do we then plan a second worship service? Do we throw our hands up in the air and say, you need to go back home because we don't have room for you? You know, when it comes to planning, when it comes to looking ahead, when it comes to trying to figure out where it is that God might be leading you as a church, numbers are very important. They set a baseline for where we are now, and that baseline becomes the marker against which we measure ourselves. If we want to go from 75 to 100 or 125, we will know that we have accomplished it because we can look at the numbers. But behind that number is a whole level of ministry that has to take place. How will we care for these 50 new people if we're trying to go from 75 to 125? Will we be able to meet their spiritual needs? Are they bringing children in? Do we have the right things in place in our Sunday school department or in our youth department? Or is the church even equipped at all to handle children? These are the kind of questions that go behind the numbers. It's great to be able to sit down and say, I want to increase my worship attendance by 50 over the next year. Do you have in place the processes, the things that you need to do to, first of all, attract enough people to add 50 to your church roll, so to speak, but then to keep them there, to assimilate them into the life of your congregation? I know the Star Trek fans out there love that word, assimilate. But that's what we're doing. We are assimilating. We are bringing them in and helping them to become a part of our system, of our organization, of our church. And in the process of doing that, we have to be prepared. We can't just suddenly deal with the influx without thinking ahead and looking at the ramifications of trying to bring that many people in. Now, we're talking about in our church reaching out to a group of younger families with children. And when I heard his broadcast, and his live broadcast is based entirely around that concept about reaching younger families, that's the reason I listened to it, it got me to thinking, if we bring in, say 15 families and each of them has one or two kids, that means an extra 15 to 25 children, an extra 30 adults. Can our church handle that? Do we have the Sunday school classes in place? Do we have the teachers that we need? Do we have the nursery capability? Do we have all the things that are necessary? It's great to dream and to vision and to think that this is what can be. But getting from where we are to what can be, there are some steps we've got to take. There are some plans that we've got to make. There's some things that we got to do to make that kind of thing happen. And so that's one of the metrics that he sort of hinted at. Another thing that he hinted at, switching over to reaching out to younger families now, he said you've got to find a way to keep in touch with them. And he uses something called the monthly touch, which I really like that term. I'll give him full credit for it. But he paints the picture of attendance and the metrics that go along with that. It's great to say we have an average of 75. He said maybe instead of looking at the average of 75, you need to look at how many you actually reach. For instance, take a month. He says don't pick December, that's when everybody comes to church. Pick another month during the year and then literally look at your attendance. We can do that at my church because we take attendance each week of the worship service. You'd have to do some way of doing it yourself if you don't have those kind of numbers. But rather than look to see what the average for the month was, look to see how many different people came. You might have an average of 75, but you may actually be reaching 100 because they're all not going to be there at the same time. Because worship attendance, as I have mentioned in previous podcasts, is not necessarily on the decline, but the frequency of worship attendance is on the decline. People that used to come 4 Sundays a month, now, I've come as a regular attender if I've been there 3 Sundays a month. Some folks think that if they come 1 Sunday a month, they are a regular attender and involved in the life of your church. And he says it's those 1 Sunday a month people, especially if you're trying to reach out to a younger crowd, that you've got to figure out a way to communicate with. Because if you make your announcements about upcoming events on the Sunday that they're not there, they're not going to know about it. They're not going to know that you have something planned for their children next week. They're not going to know that there's this special meal that everyone's invited to. They're not going to know, you see, if they aren't there on the particular Sunday that you make that particular announcement. So that means announcements have to go more than 1 Sunday. They have to stretch across time. But he also says, and here's his term again, there has to be that monthly touch. There has to be that time in which you as the church deliberately reach out with them and communicate. It can be through printed a newsletter. It can be through a emailed newsletter. It can be through a text that has a link to your website that has the newsletter on it in PDF format. It can be lots of different ways. It can be a text about things happening this week. However you want to do it, you've got to find a way, and I say not only with the younger families, but with all your families, of keeping in touch with them, because the norm of 4 Sundays a month attendance is no longer the norm. People just don't make it every Sunday anymore. And the reason that you are losing in terms of average worship attendance is probably not because people are leaving your church. It's probably because they are just not attending at the same frequency they used to attend. And so you need to look at those kind of things, and you need to figure out a way to measure and to respond to those kinds of demographic changes, those changes in the metrics that you use to figure out what is going on at your church. Well, I think I've given you enough there to think about today. What with the end of the year report still fresh on my mind and hearing him talk about numbers today, well, we need to think about numbers. We need to look at them as our friends. You know, I used to be a statistician for the annual conference, and so I know all about numbers. I love numbers, and you can look at numbers in lots of different ways, but it's time for us to start using them in ways that will help us to make a more positive impact on the ministry we have within our communities. So that's it for the podcast. Now, I just want to remind you, however, that I'm trying to get back onto a weekly schedule. I'm going to be attending Convocation. That means that I'm going to be in a room and a place where there's lots of minister friends. Look me up. I would love to pull you aside somewhere. I've got a real portable system that I use now, and just ask you some quick questions. I'd like to get together with 2 or 3 of you maybe and have a little forum on what it's like to be in the ministry. There's all kinds of possibilities going through my mind. But look me up at Convocation if you're there. Let's get together and talk, because the more of you I talk to there, the more presentations for the podcast. Let's be honest, I got to have people to talk to, because you're not going to listen to me week after week. I really like it when I get a chance to talk with folks. And I think that from the responses I get to some of these podcasts, you all really like it when I talk with and interview people as well. So look me up. Let's have a conversation. I'm praying for you. Pray for me. Pray for the podcast. There's some things happening in my personal life. My mom has been diagnosed with cancer, so if you'd like to keep her in your prayers, I'd greatly appreciate that. And, I'm going to try to keep this regular Wednesday kind of podcast up now that the Christmas and New Year's and vacations are behind me. I'm going to try to get back into the swing of things. And so I hope to see you. Well, I don't see you. I don't even hear you. You hear me. I hope you hear me. Same time next week as I continue the Wesleyan Connection podcast. God bless. Have a great day, and I pray that God would richly bless you and your family and your church and the ministries of the church in your community. God bless. This is Pastor Goodman. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Wesleyan Connection. Be sure to check back often for more podcasts.